For 40 years, Frank Glaser lived a life that would kill most men in days. He crossed freezing rivers alone, out-tracked native hunters, shot wolves for the government but respected them more than most humans, and called a dirt-floored cabin home for 13 brutal winters. He walked the line between hunter and naturalist, killer and caretaker, myth and man. Here's what life was really like for Alaska's most fearless mountain man you've never heard of. Before we start, if these stories help you sleep, hit subscribe so you don't miss any. Comment where you're at and the time too. Kind of fun seeing all the different places. Someone from Iceland commented once and I had to Google what time zone that even is. Okay, tonight we're heading to Alaska in 1915, but before we go anywhere, get cozy. Like, actually cozy. Pillows good? Blanket situation handled? Perfect. Trust me on this one. You wake up to pitch darkness, the kind of darkness that swallows everything. Your breath clouds in front of your face, visible even in the dim light. It's so cold your nose hairs have frozen, not like the gentle chill that has you reaching for an extra blanket. We're talking about the kind of cold that kills. This is Alaska, 1915, and right now you're Frank Glaser. 26 years old, single, done with normal life. A few hours ago, you walked out of Washington State with 2 duffels, a .306 Winchester rifle, binoculars, and what the locals might call a hunger for chaos. You've just stepped off the SS Mariposa onto Alaskan soil, and what greets you isn't a welcome committee. It's 25 feet of snow in Thompson Pass. You'll never make it, someone tells you. 3 men died trying to reach Fairbanks last month. You just adjust your pack straps and keep walking. See, the thing about Frank Glaser that made him different, he wasn't running to something. He wasn't chasing gold or glory like everyone else flooding into Alaska back then. He was just done. Done with whatever passed for civilization back in Washington. Done with people, probably. I came to Alaska looking for game, he'd say years later. What I found was something wilder. What he found was a 371-mile death march to Fairbanks. I'm serious. That's what it was. No roads, no trains, just a crude trail through what locals described as part sludge pit, part ice trap, part murder alley. And Frank walked right into it without blinking. The locals in Valdez didn't sugarcoat it. Too much snow in the pass, they warned, and rivers got no bridges. 2 men got killed in Copper Center last fall. You know what most people would do hearing that? Turn around, get back on the boat, tell everyone back home, yeah, I tried Alaska, wasn't for me, not Frank. Instead, he finds an old sourdough. That's what they called the experienced pioneers, the ones who'd survived at least one winter, and convinces the guy to be his trail partner. Frank shoves his supplies into a rucksack and they hit the trail. The rest of the newcomers, the soft city chichacos as the locals called them, were hauling way too much gear and wearing what might as well have been dress shoes. Once they hit waist-deep snow, they broke. Feet sore, packs soaked, spirits crushed. Picture this, you're knee-deep in snow that sometimes goes up to your waist. Your boots are soaked through, your toes are numb, then painful, then numb again, which is worse because that's when frostbite sets in. One guy named Knockout Solomon, and I'm not making that up, was cursing non-stop because his fancy high-end boots basically chewed his feet into raw meat. Should have gone with moose hide, the sourdough probably told him. Too late now, but Frank just kept walking. I've been outdoors, I've hiked, I've camped, but this was a different universe of hardship. The nights were brutal, the snow would crust just enough to make you think it was solid, then cave in without warning. You'd plunge waist deep, have to claw your way out, then take 2 more steps and repeat the whole process. You'll never make it unless it crusts again tonight, the owner of Ptarmigan Drop Roadhouse told them. Frank didn't wait. Waiting meant frostbite or worse. The thing about Alaska that I don't think we can even comprehend today is the rivers. Today we've got bridges, right? Highways, GPS. Back then, you'd hit a river and there'd be nothing. No bridge, no boat, just an icy torrent cutting through your path. So what do? Well, if you're Frank Glaser in 1915, the answer is simple and also completely insane. You strip naked. Yeah. In temperatures that could freeze spit before it hits the ground, you take off your clothes, you bundle them up with your gear to keep them dry, then you wade through a river so cold it feels like your skin is being sliced open with every step. One time, Frank actually soaked his bleeding feet in the freezing water, then dried them, pulled on fresh socks, and kept moving. That toughened me up, he said later, like it was nothing, like stepping into ice water with open wounds was just a normal Tuesday. I'd have quit right there, would have been like, you know what, Washington State wasn't so bad. The roadhouses came every 20 miles or so. Some were open, some were boarded up tight. At Upper Tonsina, Frank got a bed and immediately regretted it. His trail partner took one look at him the next day and said, "You're lousy, Glaser. Should have checked the bed." Lousy, as in covered in lice. After that, Frank chose stars over sheets. Decided he'd rather freeze than itch. That sourdough partner eventually peeled off to work a mine, and so Frank went solo, that's right, alone in one of the most hostile environments on Earth, without GPS or cell phones or Gore-Tex or any of the high-tech gear we'd consider essential today. He slept by day and hiked by night, constantly scanning for game, for shelter, for anything that seemed off. He'd developed this sixth sense already, something that would define him for the next 4 decades, an awareness of everything around him, a way of reading the wild like it was sending him signals no one else could hear. At Copper Center, he developed what locals called musher's knee, this deep, grinding ache from dragging 60 pounds through mud and snow. The local fix? Stand in an icy stream until your legs go numb, dry off, keep going. I mean, the medical care back then was basically just various forms of torture that sometimes accidentally helped. And this remedy, it sounds insane, but it actually worked. The cold reduced inflammation, numbed the pain. People who live in extreme environments develop extreme solutions. You know what's interesting about that trail? A historian once told me? It didn't just test your body, it messed with your head. Copper Center had stories that would follow Frank. There, the McRaes bred silver and black foxes worth a fortune. Frank learned quick that if you mess with a nesting vixen, she'll kill her own pups rather than let them be taken. He also heard about a triple murder from the previous fall. One guy's arm turned up in a sled dog's mouth, another had 7.22 bullets in his back. Picture yourself there. You're alone in the wilderness, it's getting dark, and you've just heard about dismembered bodies being found in this exact area. Plus, now the snow is turning to bog, which means mosquitoes. Not the annoying kind we deal with in summer. We're talking swarms so thick they could block out the sun. They hit like they'd been starving for weeks. Frank picked up a bed net at a trading post. Might have been the smartest thing he ever bought, an old-timer told me. In Galkana, he passed a signal corps shack where a lynx lounged on the desk and rode stray dogs like ponies. Tame Dal sheep climbed haylofts, foxes twitched in wire cages, marten farms bloomed in the mud. It's like the wild and civilization blurred into one weird mess. That's Alaska for you. Places where the rules we take for granted just don't apply. Then came sourdough. Not a person, a roadhouse, and not just any roadhouse. This one was run by swearing Molly, 6'2", sharp-tongued, didn't take crap from anyone. She cursed like a dock worker and cooked like a chef. When Frank showed up, she was mid-rant, chasing some poor guy out with a storm of insults. Then she looked at Frank like nothing had happened and said, "You hungry? Come in, have some coffee." Her place was spotless. Carpeted floors, curtained windows, warm fire. It was a magnet for traders, trappers, drifters, anyone with a story or scars. Molly ran the joint like a queen. Once she got sweet on a driver named Jack Bishop. He mailed her a fake gold nugget made of salt. She showed it off all summer, thought she'd struck it rich. When the truth came out, she vowed revenge, then forgave him by spring. That was Molly, fire and grace wrapped up in boots. When Frank left, the ground got worse. Spruce log roads turned to deep, sucking mud. The trail climbed again past Paxton Lake, past Summit Lake, both frozen solid in May. Somewhere along the ice, Frank met Bobby Sheldon, the first guy to drive from Fairbanks to Valdez. He was hacking at ice, trying to drag a busted Model T across it. Frank jumped in, swinging tools for hours. Bobby was a real pioneer, Frank would say later, almost with admiration, which wasn't something he gave out easily. A miner named Matt McGovern, 52, joined Frank for a stretch. Decent guy until he almost shot Frank while fiddling with a pistol. Then McGovern remembered he'd left $400 in a vest back at Paxton's, about $11,000 in today's money. The guy turned around, ran all the way back and came grinning with the cash like it was no big deal. These people weren't normal, none of them, including Frank. They timed river crossings for noon before meltwater swelled from the day's sun. Midnight hits and those rivers will kill you, Frank said. One wrong step and you're gone. He saw it happen later. Sheldon lost a whole Model T to a river and spent weeks pretending to pan gold out of the wreck. I guess when you lose everything, you either break down or make jokes. At Yost's Roadhouse, things turned gloomy. 12 people had frozen to death there one winter. Blizzards blinded travelers just yards from the door. The army had put up a fence and a bell that clanged in the wind, hoping it might save the next poor soul who got caught out there. Frank also heard about stagecoach passengers dumped in a whiteout, crawling blind in the snow while a signal corps sergeant dragged them in one at a time. And past Yost's, the wild bit back. Grizzly tracks the size of snowshoes crossed the trail. Frank always kept his rifle loaded and close. Snowshoe hares bolted like sparks, tearing bark off willows like locusts. The rhythm out there was simple. Eat, freeze, survive, repeat. By the time Frank limped into Fairbanks, he was wrecked, scarred from lice, feet shredded, eyes hollow. He'd walked nearly 400 miles through some of the nastiest terrain on the continent. Broke, beat up, tough as rawhide, but he'd made it. He was home, nobody there to greet him. No parade, no handshake, no welcome to Fairbanks banner, just a raw frontier town full of people either chasing fortune or running from something. Frank wasn't doing either. He was just looking for a place where he could be alone with the wild, a place that would test him every day, a place where survival wasn't taken for granted. He found it, and in doing so, he found himself. You lie in your bed, unlike Frank, who slept on frozen ground or in lousy roadhouses. You pull your blanket tighter, grateful for walls that keep out the wind, for running water that isn't a freezing river you have to cross naked, for the simple luxury of being warm, of being safe. And as you drift, you wonder, what would make a man choose that life? What was Frank Glaser running from? Or maybe, what was he running toward? This was just the beginning. Frank Glaser's Alaskan adventure had only just begun, and the wild was waiting to test him in ways he couldn't imagine. The wolves hadn't even entered his story yet, but they would, soon enough. Frank Glaser didn't hunt for sport. He hunted to eat, to survive, to make a dollar. In Alaska, meat was currency, and currency meant staying alive. Frank limped into Fairbanks with feet torn to shreds, his body battered from the journey, but his eyes, they were scanning the horizon already. He saw nothing but wild country stretched in every direction and went straight to work. From 1915 to 1924, Frank was what they called a market hunter. In those days, before supermarkets and refrigerated trucks, the people in frontier towns like Fairbanks needed meat. Miners, traders, roadhouse operators, they all had money, but they didn't have the time or skills to hunt. That's where men like Frank came in. He scouted the Alaska Range, picked his grounds, and got busy. The rhythm was simple: shoot, butcher, haul, sell, repeat. You're probably thinking, wait, he just walked 371 miles through hell and now he's going hunting? Yeah, that's exactly what he did. No rest, no recovery time. The wilderness doesn't give you a break just because you're tired. Frank moved through the slopes near the Valdez Trail like a shadow. Caribou, Dall sheep, moose. He tracked them through silence, through storms, knew their patterns like a map burned into his head. He carried that .306 Winchester like it was part of his arm. When Frank raised that rifle, one guy said years later, something dropped every time. He packed light when he hunted. Just the rifle, some ammunition, basic supplies. He'd disappear into the backcountry for days at a time. No radio, no backup, just Frank and whatever animal he was tracking. When he returned to civilization, he hauled hundreds of pounds of meat, sometimes dragging it through snow on a makeshift sled, sometimes packing it over ridgeline trails on his back. He sold it for 25 cents a pound. That's about $7 in today's money. There was no show to it, no ego, just blood, cold, and the math of survival. "How do you know where to find that moose?" someone once asked him. Frank just shrugged. "You listen to what the land's telling you." One time he dropped a moose cow deep in the woods, miles from anywhere. Most hunters would have taken the choice cuts and left the rest. Not Frank. He hauled the meat out solo, load by load, over 3 days, slept under spruce boughs when skies were clear, huddled by warm rocks when they weren't. No partner, no backup. "I got used to it," he said later. "Didn't need anybody. I had the animals." Game was thick in Alaska back then, and surprisingly fearless. Animals hadn't learned to fear humans yet. There just weren't enough people around. He once spotted Dall sheep across a canyon. They didn't see him. He belly crawled a mile through frozen brush, picked one, dropped it, then skinned it in the snow and packed it home. For Frank, there was no thrill in the kill, just meat, money, and calculating how long it would last. You have to understand, market hunting wasn't a job. It was survival. There were no roads, no shortcuts, just rough trails, steep climbs, deep creeks, 1 minute sun, next minute blizzard. The weather turns on you up there, an old-timer told me once. No warning. Blue sky can go white in 10 minutes, then you're in trouble. Once a storm pinned Frank down for 3 days. He crawled under spruce boughs, a moose carcass just yards away. The wind howled like a banshee. That's not just a saying, that's actually what it sounds like when wind cuts through black spruce at 40 below. Frank curled up in his sleeping bag and hoped the bears didn't smell the meat. "Too cold to worry," he said later. "Too cold to move." Food ran thin often. He shot ptarmigan when he could find them, those Arctic grouse that turn white in winter. When game was scarce, he boiled bones and scraps, dug roots, picked bulbs, ate whatever the land offered. "I didn't waste nothing," he said. "If I killed it, I used it." Unlike trophy hunters, Frank didn't care about antlers unless they meant extra cash. "I never shot cows if I could help it," he said. Same with ewes. Took bulls, took rams, left the breeders. He didn't do this out of some ethical stance or conservation mindset. It was pure logic. If you kill the breeding females, there won't be any game next year. And if there's no game, you starve. Frank hunted where the ground tried to kill you. Loose rock, ice-covered logs, steep slopes, places where a twisted ankle meant death. Rivers like the Delta and Little Tock weren't just cold, they were deadly. In spring, they rose fast, fed by snowmelt. One crossing, he lost half a moose when his pack slipped. Meat gone. Damn shame, he said. That was good meat. His rifle was part of him. Even in his 60s, he wore no glasses. He could spot fur on a ridge at distances that made other hunters squint. The gun was always loaded, always within reach, not just for hunting, for protection. If you've never been in bear country, you can't understand what it means to be prey. In most of our modern lives, we're at the top of the food chain. We don't think about being eaten, but in Alaska, especially back then, you were just another animal. And often you weren't the biggest or the strongest. The winters were dead quiet. Snow muffled every sound. Wind whispered through trees. Frank went weeks without hearing a human voice. I never got lonesome, he told a writer named Jim Reardon years later. I had my rifle, I had work to do. He packed meat to roadhouses and camps, anywhere that paid. A quarter a pound mattered when you had nothing. I could pack 100 pounds easy, Frank said. Did it all the time. His journal entries from those years don't ramble, just facts, clipped and direct. Shot 2 moose, packed 1 down, too much snow for dogs, slept rough, snowed all night. Another entry, wind bad, nearly lost sled, killed 1 caribou, feet froze. There was no room for mistakes. Twist a knee, you're stuck. No food, you starve. Break an ankle, you die. But Frank didn't slow down. He kept moving, tracking, hauling, hustling meat through deep snow and dead silence just to earn a buck. No rangers, no safety net, just you, your rifle, and whatever you could carry out. You're lying in your warm bed right now, maybe sipping something hot, comfortable, safe. Frank went years without any of that. Years where each day was a fight to survive, where comfort was a luxury he couldn't afford. You know what really stands out about Frank during these years? He was alone, completely alone, but he wasn't running from people. He wasn't some misanthrope who hated humanity. He just preferred the quiet, the simplicity of survival, the honest transaction between him and the wild. People complicate things, he said once. Animals are straight with you. They're trying to live. Same as you. No lies, no games. The hunting was hard physical labour, but it suited him. Up before dawn most days, moving through forest and tundra in silence, reading tracks, watching wind direction, checking snow conditions. Frank spoke the wild's language, moved through it like he belonged. "Game's smarter than you think," he said once. You got to outthink it, outwalk it, outfreeze it if that's what it takes. The Alaska Range, where Frank did most of his hunting, is brutal country. Peaks jutting up to 13,000 feet, valleys so deep they don't see sun for months in winter, glaciers that can swallow you whole if you step wrong. Frank knew every ridge, every pass. He learned the terrain inch by inch, paid for that knowledge with frozen fingers and hungry nights. He had a map in his head, said Oscar Vogel, who knew him later, more detailed than anything on paper. Most market hunters worked in pairs at least, sharing the load, watching each other's backs. Frank preferred going solo, less talk, more focus. No one to slow him down or second-guess his decisions, and his decisions were absolute. If he decided to cross a pass in a storm, that's what he did. If he chose to track a bull moose for 3 days, he stayed with it until the job was done. One winter, temperatures dropped to 60 below for 2 weeks straight. Most hunters stayed in, waited it out. Frank kept working. He'd build small fires, just enough to keep his hands functioning, then move on, keep the blood flowing, stay alive. Cold will kill you, a trapper told me once, but so will sitting still. It's a balance. Frank found that balance. He respected the cold, prepared for it, but never surrendered to it. There was one close call in 1920. Frank was tracking a caribou herd near the Tok River when a storm blew in from nowhere. Visibility dropped to 0, wind howling, snow blasting sideways. He lost the trail, lost his bearings. For 3 hours he wandered, growing colder by the minute. Most people would have panicked. Frank just kept moving, working in a grid pattern until he found a familiar landmark, a lightning-struck spruce he recognized even in the whiteout. From there, he navigated to a line shack he knew was nearby, spent 3 days there, waiting out the storm. "Wasn't worried," he said later, "just inconvenienced." The man's capacity for understatement was legendary. By 1924, Frank had established himself as one of the most reliable meat hunters in interior Alaska. Store owners would pay premium prices for his game because they knew it would be properly dressed, properly handled. Frank's meat never spoiled, one shopkeeper said. Man knew how to treat an animal from kill to kitchen. But something was changing in Frank. Years alone in the wild, watching animals, tracking them, killing them, it changes a person. You start to see patterns, start to understand the balance of things. Frank was noticing wolves more and more, seeing how they hunted, how they moved, how they lived. They fascinated him, not as targets, as teachers. The wolves of Alaska were different from those in the lower 48. Bigger, for one thing. 130 pounds wasn't uncommon. Smart, too. They hunted in coordinated packs, taking down moose 10 times their size. Frank watched them whenever he could, made notes, observed their habits. He wasn't studying them scientifically. He was learning from them, the way they chose their prey, the way they moved through snow, the way they conserved energy. Wolves don't waste effort, he told a biologist years later. They don't show off. They do what needs doing, then rest. People could learn from that. Most hunters hated wolves, saw them as competition, as vermin to be eliminated. Frank saw them differently, with respect, maybe even admiration. Don't get me wrong, he wasn't sentimental about them. He still hunted, still killed for meat and money, but he recognized something in those wolves. A kindred spirit, maybe. Another survivor in a land that killed the careless. Winter in Alaska isn't just cold, it's dark. Near the Arctic Circle, the sun barely rises in December and January. Just a few hours of twilight, then darkness again. It messes with your head all that night. Frank adapted, started using the darkness like wolves do, hunting at dusk and dawn when prey is moving, but visibility still works in your favor. He became nocturnal when needed, diurnal when that made more sense. You don't fight the land, he said. You don't fight the weather or the light. You work with what's given. By the end of 1924, Frank was looking for something different. The market hunting was steady work, but it wasn't challenging him anymore. He wanted something more permanent, something he could build. He'd been eyeing a spot along the Savage River, deep in what's now Denali National Park. Remote, wild, game-rich, perfect. That fall, he made his decision. He'd build a cabin there, stake his claim, make it home. I wanted a place, he said simply, just a place that was mine. For nearly a decade, Frank had lived like a ghost, passing through the Alaska wilderness, leaving almost no trace. Now he was ready to put down roots, just not anywhere near other people. The Savage River would be his home for the next 13 years, and there in that isolated valley the legend of the Wolfman would truly begin. That's where we'll pick up next. Frank building his cabin on the Savage River, a home so remote that months would pass without him seeing another human face, a place where wolves would become his closest neighbours, his subjects of study, and eventually his prey. But that night, as he prepared for this new chapter, Frank Glaser slept under stars so bright and cold they seemed to burn. The northern lights danced green and purple across the black sky. The temperature dropped to 30 below. And Frank, wrapped in his sleeping bag beside a small fire, was exactly where he wanted to be. You pull your blanket a little tighter, thinking about that kind of cold, the kind that burns your lungs when you breathe, the kind that turns your breath to ice crystals that fall tinkling to the ground. You're warm, comfortable, safe. Frank Glaser chose to live without any of that comfort in exchange for something most of us will never understand: absolute freedom, absolute solitude, absolute independence. Was it worth it? For Frank, there was never any question. The wild had claimed him. He belonged to Alaska now. Frank Glaser built his Savage River cabin in 10 days flat. No crew, no plans, no power tools, just an axe, muscle, and a brain made for solving problems in the middle of nowhere. Picture yourself in his boots for a second. It's 1924. There's no Home Depot, no YouTube tutorials, no one to call if things go wrong. Just you, standing in a clearing, surrounded by spruce trees and silence, thinking, all right, I need a place that will keep me alive through winter. And winter in Alaska isn't your average winter. It's not grab another sweater cold. It's your spit freezes before it hits the ground cold. It's make one mistake and they'll find your body in spring cold. The cabin Frank built wasn't pretty. Sod roof, dirt floor, logs sealed with mud, ugly as sin but warm, and it was his. Every inch of it came from his own hands. The location was deliberate, deep in the Alaska range. No roads, no people, just how he liked it. By 1924, Frank was done with towns, done with anything resembling civilization. Savage River gave him space, game, and peace. He stayed 13 years. Most people can't stay in one apartment for 13 months without getting restless. I needed a place where I could hear myself think, he told a visitor years later. Fairbanks was getting too crowded. Fairbanks at the time had maybe 2,000 people. The winters there could freeze your lungs when you breathed too deeply, but Frank didn't care. He thrived in conditions that would kill most people in hours. No neighbours, no noise, just wind and wolves. Those wolves, their howls echoed through the valleys at night. When most people heard that sound, they reached for a rifle. When Frank heard it, he listened, really listened, started to learn the different tones, the various messages. Wolves talk to each other, he said once. Not like people talk, better, no lies in it. The cabin became his headquarters. From there, he trapped, hunted, and sometimes hiked blind through blizzards. No compass, just instinct. I always knew where I was, he said years later. Could read the country like a book. His journal from those years was all business. Snowed all night. Cut firewood. Wolf tracks near trapline. But between those clipped lines, life was incredibly rough. When food ran low, he boiled spruce bark for tea. He skinned frozen kills by lantern light, his fingers blue with cold. He dried soaked boots by the stove, knowing that wet feet meant death when temperatures hit 50 below. He always kept his rifle loaded and within reach, not for wolves, but for grizzlies. Spring brought them in close, hungry after hibernation, ready to claim whatever food they could find. One journal entry read simply, "Had a hell of a time crossing river." That's all he wrote. But years later, he told the full story. Swept into an ice-choked current, rifle under one arm, pack-soaked, boots dragging like anchors. He clawed his way to shore, half frozen but alive. In his journal. Just those 8 words. The man didn't waste breath, even on paper. Here's where Frank's story takes a turn that makes him different from other mountain men, other trappers. He didn't just live near wolves, he raised them. Each spring he'd find dens, snatch a few pups and bring them home. He raised them alongside his sled dogs. The result? A team of half-wild, all-muscle hybrids he called wolf dogs. They'd fight like devils, he said, but run like hell when you hooked them up. He fed them caribou scraps, watched how they moved, named them King, Queenie. They weren't pets. Frank didn't do pets. They were workers, partners, a piece of the wild, leashed but never truly tamed. You know how some people get really into their hobbies, like they start making sourdough bread, and suddenly their Instagram is nothing but loaf pictures. Frank got like that with wolves, but there was no Instagram. Just him, alone in his cabin, turning into an amateur scientist. Inside the cabin, Frank became a field biologist without even realizing it. He tracked prints in the snow, studied scat, took detailed notes, sketched wolf movements in the margins of his journal. The walls of his cabin gradually filled with observations, notes on pack structure, hunting patterns, communication, not because anyone asked him to, not for money or fame, just because the wolves fascinated him. By the mid-1930s, Frank dug deeper into wolf study. Alone in his Savage River cabin, something changed. The hunter became a student. He observed how wolves hunted, how they took down the weak, old, or slow prey. People say they kill for fun, he wrote in a note to himself. Not true. They kill to live, and they're better at it than most men. They used their heads, he noticed. Didn't rush, waited, worked together, set up ambushes, cut animals out from herds, tested for weakness before committing to a kill. He saw the dark side too. Wolves turned on their own when resources got scarce. One mistake during a hunt could get you ostracized or dead. They're cold like that, Frank said. No second chances. He took notes on everything. Kills, tracks, scat, even how high they peed on trees. This stuff mattered to Frank. It wasn't just curiosity. It was survival knowledge. Understanding wolves meant understanding the wild. Even professional biologists eventually came to him with questions. A scientist named Adolph Murray used Frank's notes in his book, The Wolves of Mount McKinley. Government officials treated Frank like a field guide in boots. He knew wolves top to bottom, said trapper Oscar Vogel years later, taught me tricks I'd never thought of, and the twist? The more Frank learned, the less he hated them. Yes, he still trapped them when necessary. Yes, he still saw them as competition for game. But something had changed in his perspective. Eliminating wolves? Frank hated that idea, according to fellow agent Jim King years later. It wasn't about wiping them out. It was about balance. By his 50s, folks just called him the Wolfman. A letter with just that name could still reach him in Fairbanks. He didn't pick the nickname, but it fit. He could track a wolf like it was his brother. He knew where they slept, where they crossed rivers, where they chewed bones in the sun. Frank wasn't soft, but he was fair. Wolves, he said, were survivors, and in Alaska, that was the highest compliment. But Savage River wasn't just about blood and biology. It was isolation, deep and harsh, the kind modern people can barely comprehend. Frank could go months without seeing another soul. Winter arrived early up there, usually by September. Snow buried his cabin to the eaves. Temperatures dropped past 50 below and stayed there for weeks. Firewood ran low. Frostbite took pieces of his ears, his nose, his fingers. Yet he never complained, never even seemed to notice the hardship. "I had what I needed," he said. "Meat, water, quiet. What else is there?" Sometimes midwinter, he swore he heard voices, the isolation playing tricks on his mind. Once, a grizzly raided his meat stash but left no tracks in the fresh snow. "Must have been a ghost," he said. Maybe joking, maybe not. Up there, the line between reality and imagination gets thin when you go months without human contact. The solitude affected people differently. Some broke down, couldn't handle it. Frank seemed to need it, like most people need air. "You want to know what silence really sounds like?" he once asked a young trapper. "Come to my place mid-January. That's silence. So quiet, you can hear the blood moving in your ears." One winter, a storm pinned him in the cabin for 3 weeks straight, wind howling, snow piling up so high he had to tunnel out to check his traps. Most people would go stir-crazy. Frank just worked on his wolf notes, repaired gear, read the few books he kept. "Gave me time to think," was all he said about it. His day-to-day existence was all about routine. Wake with the dim winter light around 10 a.m, build up the fire, melt snow for water, check snares close to the cabin, split wood, repair equipment, feed the dogs, all of it harsh physical labor in killing cold. But there was peace in it too, a rhythm most of us will never know. "The thing about Frank," one old-timer told me, "he didn't fight against the wild. He just flowed with it, like water finding its way around rocks." Spring was the hardest time, when snow turned to mud, when rivers swelled with meltwater, when hibernating bears woke hungry. The cabin would start to leak, mold would grow in corners, the dirt floor turned damp. "Ugliest damn time of year," Frank called it. But it brought fresh game, new wolf pups, a chance to repair winter damage, and the midnight sun, those endless summer days where it never gets truly dark. Time to range farther from the cabin, to explore, to build up stores for the next winter. Fall was his favourite. "Everything makes sense in fall," he wrote. Animals fattening up for winter, berries hanging heavy on bushes, the first dusting of snow showing tracks clear as a road map, the world preparing, like him, for the big freeze. In his 6th year at Savage River, the wolves changed, or maybe Frank's perception of them changed. He started seeing them not as competitors, not as subjects of study, but as neighbours, teachers. Something between fear and respect bloomed. A man can live his whole life in cities, surrounded by people, and never understand half of what a wolf knows by its first winter, he said. He gave names to the packs around his territory. The Ridge Pack, the River Pack, knew the alphas by sight, watched the complex social dynamics play out season after season, saw how they passed knowledge to younger wolves, how they adapted to changing conditions. One day, checking his traps, he found a massive black wolf caught by the paw. Most trappers would have shot it immediately. Frank looked at it for a long time. The wolf stared back, yellow eyes unblinking. No fear, just acceptance. Frank shot it, of course. That was his job, his living. But afterward, he sat with the body for hours, skinning it with unusual care, saving not just the pelt, but the skull, the teeth, even the bones. "Felt like I owed it that much," he told a ranger years later. "That wolf died with more dignity than most men." This growing respect for his prey troubled him sometimes, made him question what he was doing, but he was still a practical man. Wolves competed for game he needed to survive. Sometimes they killed sled dogs or went after trap lines. Balance had to be maintained, yet his methods changed. He became more selective, wouldn't take breeding females if he could help it, left the pups unless they were starving, started to think more about the role wolves played in the ecosystem. In 1937, after 13 years at Savage River, something changed. Alaska was changing. More people arriving, more pressure on the wilderness. The federal government was taking a greater interest in wildlife management. Someone in an office somewhere had heard about the trapper who knew wolves better than anyone, who lived among them, who understood them. They offered Frank Glaser a job. Not just any job. They wanted him to be a government wolf hunter. It was a strange twist. The man who'd come to respect wolves, perhaps even love them in his own gruff way, was now being asked to systematically hunt them for the government, to help control populations across Alaska. "I didn't go looking for the job," he said later. "It found me." For Frank, it wasn't a contradiction. It was just another adaptation. Wolves themselves culled the weak from herds. They understood population control. Now he would do the same for them. He accepted the position, packed up his few possessions, took a last look at the cabin that had been his home for 13 years. Wasn't sad to leave it, he told a reporter once. Cabin was just a tool, like an axe or a rifle, did what it was supposed to do. But before he left, he buried something behind the cabin. Years later, a park ranger found it while mapping old structures, a small wooden box containing a complete wolf skull, carefully cleaned and preserved. Next to it, a scrap of paper with a single sentence. "The gentleman of the woods." It was the only sentimental gesture Frank Glaser was ever known to make. As he hiked out of Savage River that spring day in 1937, wolves howled from the ridges above, maybe saying goodbye, maybe warning others of his departure. Frank Glaser had entered the next phase of his life, not just a hunter, not just a trapper, but a man with a mission to know wolves better than anyone else alive, even as he was paid to kill them. "It sounds like a contradiction," he admitted once. Maybe it was, but up here, life is full of contradictions. You kill to live, you love what you hunt. You're never more alive than when you're close to death. The cabin on Savage River still stands, or at least parts of it do. Park rangers have documented it. Historians have photographed it, a simple rectangle of rotting logs in a clearing, slowly returning to the earth. But for 13 years, it was the centre of Frank Glaser's world, a place where he found himself, where he evolved from just another mountain man to something more complex, where the legend of the Wolfman was born. As you lie in your comfortable bed, so far removed from the harsh reality Frank embraced, you might wonder what drove him to that solitude, what kept him there for 13 years. Was it escape, discovery, something deeper? Frank, if asked, would probably just shrug and say, "It suited me." In that simple cabin with its dirt floor, with wolves howling outside and temperatures that could freeze mercury, Frank Glaser wasn't just surviving, he was becoming. The government job would take him all over Alaska, would put his wolf knowledge to the test, would transform him from observer to official predator. The Wolfman was about to hunt wolves full-time with the blessing of Uncle Sam. In 1937, Frank Glaser swapped his traps for a government badge. His new job? Kill wolves. No limits, no paperwork, just results. The US Biological Survey, which would later become the Fish and Wildlife Service, hired him for one reason. Nobody knew wolves like Frank Glaser. Nobody could track them, find them, understand them the way he did. He worked solo, as always. No office, no set hours, no boss breathing down his neck. Just wild, open Alaska and a mission. One week he'd be in the White Mountains with snowshoes and a rifle. The next, crawling across frozen tundra, tracking paw prints through silence so complete you could hear snowflakes land. Frank was happiest 100 miles from anyone, knee-deep in snow, chasing wolves, one agent said years later, and that's exactly what he did. This job suited Frank in ways his previous work hadn't. Market hunting had been about survival, making a living. Trapping at Savage River had been about independence, claiming territory. This government work, this was about mastery, about being the absolute best at something difficult. The spring after he started, he developed a system for finding dens. Wolves are secretive about their breeding sites, protective of their pups. But Frank could read the land like others read books. He'd spot a slight change in a female's movement pattern, notice tracks that circled back to the same area, observe how ravens flew in certain areas. When he found a den, he'd wait. Watch, learn the comings and goings of the adults. Then, when the time was right, he'd move in. Winter, he'd set snares along travel routes. Fall, he'd lay poison baits, careful to place them where other animals wouldn't find them. Once aerial hunting was allowed, he took to the skies. A spotter pilot would fly low over the terrain, looking for wolves against the snow. Frank would lean out, rifle ready, and take his shot. One shot, he said. Miss, they're gone. Hit, you've got meat. His success rate was incredible. Other hunters would spray bullets, hope for a hit. Frank waited for the perfect moment, then fired once. Clean, efficient, almost merciful. He mastered the getter, a cyanide trap disguised as bait. One sniff and the wolf dropped. It was quick at least. No suffering. Frank insisted on that. Every wolf he killed, he logged. How many, where, when, even the weather conditions. In some remote areas, his notes were the only official records of wildlife for decades. He didn't do this paperwork because it was required. It wasn't. He did it because he believed in knowledge, in understanding. Forms didn't make him deadly. Instinct did. He could read a single hair on snow like a detective. He knew the ridge they'd use, the creek they'd cross, where the alpha would mark territory. Frank could look at grass and tell you what wolves were thinking, one agent said. It wasn't an exaggeration. Locals, particularly the native Alaskans, called him Amaguk Frank, Wolf Frank. He spoke their language, not just the human dialects, but the language of sign, of track, of movement that told stories across the snow. He simply beat wolves at their own game. He became the apex predator in a land full of them. In 1948, the government sent him to Nunivak Island to protect muskox from local hunters. The native people there had been killing the animals, which were being reintroduced after near extinction. Most government men would have gone in hard, with rules and threats. Frank just talked to them, explained the situation, listened to their concerns. After that, the killing stopped, a pilot reported. They listened to him. He was straight with them. Frank never sugarcoated his work. Wolves breed fast, he wrote in a report. Traps alone won't cut it. You need poison, planes, den work. The whole deal. Hit hard, don't stop. But even as he said these things, even as he killed wolves more efficiently than any man alive, he respected them, admired them even. Long before GPS collars and remote cameras, long before wildlife biology was a common field of study, Frank was out there with binoculars, watching packs cross frozen rivers, mapping their movements, noting the alpha's lead position, the flanks, the way they herded caribou like soldiers on a raid. I don't mind shooting wolves, he wrote once to the Game Commission, but when I find one in my trap, I feel ashamed. They're the real gentlemen of the predatory family. It's a strange contradiction to respect something so deeply while also hunting it, but for Frank there was no contradiction. It was pure survival, pure ecology. Wolves themselves culled the weak from herds. They understood population control. Frank was just doing the same for them. He called himself a conservationist, yet joined predator control, raised wolf dogs, shot wild ones, loved their cunning, hated what they did to the herds. You got to keep the balance, he said. Too many wolves and you got no game. His bosses trusted him completely. There's something powerful in that, being so good at something so difficult that people just get out of your way, let you do what needs doing. As long as I'm director, you've got a job, one boss told him. They'd let him disappear for weeks into the wilderness. He always came back with pelts and data. Frank would file his report, then get antsy to head back out, said one biologist who worked with him. Didn't matter how cold it got. That's when he felt most alive. He rode with university scientists and made them look like lost tourists. One professor watched Frank read the land like a book and said, "He's like an Indian. He knows every bump." With Frank, town life didn't stick. Never did. He kept a room at the Nordale Hotel in Fairbanks and boarded his wolf dogs nearby, but he was rarely around. The wilderness called him, and whenever he was in town, he talked non-stop. All day, breakfast to last patrol, one partner said. But his stories moved. They had rhythm. They took you places most people never went. Frank knew what worked. Wolf control is simple, he told a rookie agent once. Find the alpha female, take her out, the pack scatters, sometimes they never reform. Simple, but not easy. Finding that alpha female meant knowing her habits, her preferences, her personality. Frank treated each wolf pack like a puzzle to solve, a challenge to meet. One time, he tracked a particular female wolf for 6 weeks, not because anyone asked him to, not because she was causing trouble, just because she was exceptionally smart, exceptionally cautious. She avoided every trap, every poisoned bait, seemed to vanish into thin air when planes flew overhead. That one, Frank said, she was special. He finally got her with a trap so well disguised even he had trouble finding it again. When he approached, she didn't growl, didn't struggle, just watched him with those yellow eyes. He shot her, of course, that was the job, but he kept her skull, cleaned it himself. It sat on a shelf in his room at the Nordale for years. Still, the land had teeth. No matter how good Frank got, Alaska was always ready to kill him. One winter, temperatures dropped to 60 below for 3 weeks straight. Frank was tracking a pack near the Porcupine River. His dog team quit on him, refused to move. Even with their thick fur, it was too cold. He built a fire, set up his tent, waited. 2 days later, still 60 below, food running low, dogs whining. Most men would have panicked, pushed the dogs too hard, maybe lost them, lost themselves. Frank rigged a sled from spruce boughs, loaded the weakest dogs on it, hitched the stronger ones up and walked in front, breaking trail. Took him 4 days to reach a trapper's cabin. No dogs lost, no fingers lost, just another Alaska story. A young agent asked him once, "Don't you get scared out there alone?" Frank looked at him like he'd asked if water was wet. "Course I get scared," he said. "Man who doesn't get scared in the bush is a fool. Fear keeps you sharp." By the late 1940s, Frank was a legend in Alaska wildlife circles. When someone had a wolf problem, wolves killing sled dogs, wolves decimating moose calves, they called Frank. He'd look at the situation, make a decision, solve the problem, like calling a surgeon for a difficult operation, one rancher said. You don't tell him how to cut, you just let him work. In the early 1950s, when Frank was in his 60s, his methods started to change. He used more aerial hunting, less trapping. The wolf populations were shifting, moving, adapting to pressure. Wolves learn, he told a game officer. You can't use the same tricks twice. So Frank evolved. New baits, new trap setups, new flight patterns. Always thinking, always adapting, just like the wolves did. A few years later, moose populations exploded across his territory. Old-timers said they'd never seen so many, one agent reported. The wolf control was working, or so it seemed. Then Frank left. Wolves came back, moose vanished. We need another Glaser, locals would say for years afterward. He never wanted fame or thanks, just did the job, quiet and unrelenting. When Alaska became a state in 1959, the wildlife management policies changed. Frank didn't fight it. He simply stepped aside, let younger men take over. He may have never hesitated to kill, but he never forgot what he was killing. Another predator, another survivor in a harsh land, another being just trying to stay alive one more day in the great white north. In his decades as a wolf hunter, Frank killed hundreds, maybe thousands of wolves. He knew more about them than most biologists with advanced degrees, knew their habits, their family structures, their intelligence. People think wolves are just big dogs, he said once. They're not. They're something else entirely. Smarter, wilder, more complete. Frank's methods were controversial, even in his time. Some saw him as a conservation hero, keeping ungulate populations healthy by controlling predators. Others saw him as a killer, disrupting natural systems. The truth, as usual, was somewhere in between. Frank was a man of his time, working with the understanding of ecology available then. He believed in balance, in management, not in extermination. "We don't want to kill all the wolves," he told a reporter once, "just enough to keep everything in check. World needs wolves, just not too many in one place." As Frank aged, his reputation only grew. Wildlife managers across Alaska, across the whole North, consulted him, asked his advice, followed his methods. When Frank Glaser talked wolves, smart people shut up and listened, one biologist said years later. By the time he retired from active wolf hunting in 1955, Frank had changed. The young man who arrived in Alaska in 1915, looking for game and adventure, had become something rare, a man who truly understood his place in the wild, not as master, not as intruder, but as participant. "You don't conquer this country," he told a new agent on his last field trip. "You join it, or you leave. Those are the choices." Frank had joined it, merged with it, become so much a part of Alaska that separating the man from the land became impossible. The wolves had taught him that, how to belong to a place so completely that you vanish into it. He'd entered their world, learned their ways, killed them when necessary, respected them always. In doing so, he'd become something of a wolf himself, solitary, resilient, perfectly adapted to a place most humans couldn't survive. As his official hunting days ended, Frank didn't slow down much, still kept his wolf dogs, still tracked and observed, still shared his knowledge with anyone who showed genuine interest. "The government job gave me access," he said. "Let me see more wolves, more places than I could have on my own." By 1955, Frank Glaser was 66 years old. He'd spent 40 years in the Alaskan wilderness, had outlived most of his contemporaries, had survived conditions that killed younger, stronger men. The world was changing around him. Alaska was changing. Wildlife management was becoming more scientific, more bureaucratic. The era of the lone wolf hunter was ending. But Frank Glaser's legacy was just beginning. The knowledge he'd gained, the observations he'd recorded, the methods he'd developed, they formed the foundation of wolf management across the North for decades to come. As you drift towards sleep, imagine Frank out there on the snow, 66 years old, rifle across his knees, watching wolf tracks with eyes that missed nothing. The cold doesn't touch him. The solitude doesn't bother him. He is exactly where he belongs, doing exactly what he was meant to do. There's something rare in that, to find your perfect place, your perfect purpose. Most of us spend our lives searching. Frank found his in the howl of wolves across a frozen valley. His government wolf hunting days had ended, but Frank Glaser's story wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. When Frank Glaser retired from official wolf hunting in 1955, the legends were already growing around him like frost on a winter window. Some stories were true, some were stretched, some were flat out impossible, but all of them painted the picture of a man who had become more myth than flesh. Frank Glaser? Yeah, I heard he tracked a wolf pack 50 miles in a blizzard once, found 'em sleeping and took out the whole bunch. Frank? He lived on nothing but spruce needle tea and moose liver one winter, came out healthier than when he went in. That old wolf hunter? They say he could smell a wolf den from 3 miles away. In Fairbanks bars, on trap lines, around hunting campfires, the tales spread, each one making Frank a little larger, a little wilder, a little more than human. But here's the thing about wilderness legends. Underneath the exaggeration, there's usually a kernel of truth harder than permafrost. Take the car story. In 1938, Frank was driving a government vehicle along the Steese Highway. The road was icy, visibility poor, the car skidded, rolled 3 times down an embankment. Most men would have been killed instantly. Frank crawled out with cracked ribs and a cut on his head. His diary entry for that day. Rolled over 3 times, cut on head, rib injuries, dry as sawdust. No drama. Anyone else would have died, or at least milked it for sympathy. Frank just hitched a ride to the next roadhouse, got patched up, and was back tracking wolves within a week. Then there were the wolf dogs, not just working animals. These were monsters with steel trap jaws and glacier blue eyes. One massive black wolf he kept chained in a cabin let Frank stroll in with food like it was perfectly normal. Sam White, a hardened trapper who'd seen everything Alaska had to offer, said, "I wouldn't have gone near it unless it was trussed in chains." Frank didn't exactly tame these animals. He simply earned their tolerance, maybe even their trust. He understood them in a way most humans never will. Animals know when you fear them, he told a rookie agent once, and they know when you respect them. Most people get those 2 things mixed up. In the late 1950s, after his official retirement, Frank still consulted for wildlife management, still went out on expeditions, still knew the wolves of Alaska better than anyone alive. There's a story about a bison hunt around that time. Frank, in his late 60s, tags along with a college professor who'd never aimed at anything more dangerous than a thought. Frank tracks the bull, lines up the shot, and hands it off to the academic. 2 shots ring out. One hits the chest, one clips an ear, Frank's ear. The bull drops. No one asks who made the kill. They all knew. Frank just wrapped his bloody ear in a bandana and kept going. Didn't even mention it until someone noticed the blood soaking through. Bush pilots would often drop him in the Arctic with nothing but snowshoes and a rifle. 2 weeks later, he'd radio back from a completely different location with a sack full of wolf tails and a craving for fresh meat. Jim King, who worked with him in the Wildlife Service, remembered how Frank couldn't stand office work. By day 3, he'd get itchy. Wolves needed thinning, he'd say. He'd be gone before you could stop him. In Fairbanks, he stalked the streets like a wolf behind glass. People knew him. He boarded his wolf dogs nearby, kept a room at the Nordale Hotel, and bought every new rifle that came into town. He even slipped cash to broke trappers who couldn't cover their bar tabs. Frank never flashed money, an old bartender told me, but he always had it when it mattered. Even when he had money, he lived lean. Even when alone, he didn't seem lonely. He chewed snuff, quit in the hospital once, cursed it afterward, then picked it back up like nothing had changed. His boots stayed laced, rifles spotless, eyes sharp into his 60s. Never wore glasses. Could still spot a wolf on a ridge where younger men saw nothing. He moved like a man shaped by snow, sleds, and survival. When he talked, it came out in stored-up bursts like he'd been holding it in for years. To the old-timers, Frank was legend attached to memory. Governor J. Hammond called him Lobo lean with gun-bore eyes and a gait like a penned-up predator. Joked he might have been part wolf himself, always prowling, always alert, always one step from slipping into the wild again. Frank never married, never had children. The wilderness was his wife, one friend said, and the wolves were his kids. Dysfunctional family, but it worked for him. In his 70s, when most men are content to sit by windows and remember, Frank was still out there. Still tracking. Still watching. Still learning from the wolves he'd spent a lifetime studying. His methods had changed with age, less hunting, more observation. He'd spend days just watching a pack, noting their behaviours, their movements, their social dynamics. I used to kill 'em to understand 'em, he told a biologist in the 1960s. Now I just watch, learn more that way. By then, scientific methods had caught up with what Frank had known for decades. Wolf packs weren't just random groups. They were families with complex social structures. Alphas weren't always the biggest or strongest. They were the smartest, the most experienced. Wolves didn't kill for sport. They killed what they needed when they needed it. All things Frank had been saying for 40 years. Sometimes, a wildlife manager told me, I think Frank was born a century too early. He'd have made one hell of a wildlife biologist with the right schooling. But formal education was never Frank's path. His classroom had been the wild itself, his teachers the wolves he hunted and observed. His knowledge wasn't theoretical. It was earned through frozen feet and hungry nights and the kind of patience most humans can't fathom. Even in his final years, stories about Frank kept circulating. He disappeared for a month into the Brooks Range, people said, and came back with detailed maps of wolf den locations that would have taken a scientific team years to compile. He'd tracked a particular alpha female over 3 mountain ranges just because he admired her cunning. He'd sat outside a wolf den for 2 days, not moving, barely breathing, just to watch how the adults taught their pups to pounce on mice. Some of these stories were undoubtedly exaggerated, but knowing Frank, many were probably true. In a way, he'd become the alpha of his own strange pack. The wildlife managers, trappers, hunters, and biologists who followed his methods, who quoted his observations, who treated his word on wolves as gospel. Frank didn't just teach us about wolves, one agent said years later. He taught us about Alaska, about respecting what can kill you, about really seeing the land, not just looking at it. As decades passed, Alaska changed dramatically around Frank Glaser. The territory became a state in 1959. Roads pushed deeper into the wilderness. Airplanes made even the most remote areas accessible. Tourism grew. Population centers expanded. Frank watched these changes with a mixture of resignation and concern. More people meant more pressure on wildlife. More roads meant less true wilderness. More regulation meant the end of the frontier freedom he'd cherished. Place isn't the same, he'd grumble. Too damn many people. This from a man who thought Fairbanks was crowded when it had 2,000 residents. By the late 1960s, Frank's health was finally beginning to match his age. Decades of cold, of physical hardship, of survival at the edge of endurance. It takes a toll no human can escape forever. His hands, once steady enough to place a bullet exactly where he wanted it at 300 yards, began to shake slightly. His knees, which had carried him thousands of miles through snow and tundra, ached constantly. His ears, frostbitten repeatedly, were sensitive to the slightest cold. But his mind remained sharp, his knowledge intact, his stories vivid. Young wildlife researchers would seek him out, buy him a meal or a drink, ask about wolves. Frank, never one for small talk, would dismiss basic questions, but show genuine interest, ask something specific, and the floodgates would open. He talked for 6 hours straight, one biologist remembered, drew diagrams on napkins, sketched wolf hunting patterns in spilled beer on the table. Most educational night of my life. In his last decade, Frank became something of an unofficial consultant to wolf researchers across Alaska. They'd bring him maps, photographs, data. He'd point to a spot and say, "Check here, den site, south-facing slope, near water but not too near, protected from wind." And they'd check, and he'd be right, almost every time. "How do you know?" one frustrated PhD candidate asked him after Frank had correctly predicted a pack's migration route that contradicted all the researchers' carefully collected data. Frank just tapped the side of his head. 40 years watching wolves, son. Can't learn that from books. By the early 1970s, Frank was one of the last of his kind, a link to the old Alaska, the frontier Alaska, where survival depended on skill and knowledge rather than equipment and technology. He watched with a mixture of approval and skepticism as wildlife management became more scientific. Radio collars, aerial surveys, computer modelling, population dynamics. "All that science is fine," he told a game officer, "but sometimes you just need to sit and watch a wolf be a wolf. Can't put that in a computer." Frank had seen wolf populations rise and fall over decades, had seen management strategies come and go, had watched the shifting relationship between predator and prey play out across the vastness of Alaska. "Wolves and game are like a pendulum," he said. "Too many wolves, game goes down. Too few wolves, game goes up. Then disease or starvation swings it back. Our job is just to keep the swing from going too far either way." It was a simple philosophy, but one based on a lifetime of observation, of being there, on the ground, in all seasons, in all conditions, of knowing the land and its creatures intimately, personally. As Frank entered his 80s, his legend only grew. Letters addressed simply to the Wolfman, Fairbanks, Alaska, would find him without fail. People who had never met him told stories about him, claimed their father or uncle or grandfather had hunted with the famous Frank Glaser. Some of these claims were true, many weren't, but that's how legends work. They outgrow the truth, become something bigger, something that belongs not just to the man himself, but to the place, to the culture, to the collective imagination. "I heard Frank Glaser could call wolves," people would say. They'd come right to him, like he spoke their language. "I heard he lived with a pack for a month, slept in their den, ate what they ate. I heard he could smell the difference between wolf packs, know exactly whose territory he was in just by scent." Frank, when he heard these tales, would just snort and say, "Damn fools don't know a thing about wolves." But maybe, in some way, he was pleased, not at being the centre of tall tales, but at knowing wolves had become important to people, that people cared enough to make up stories, that the animals he'd spent a lifetime tracking, hunting and studying had captured the imagination of a generation who would never know the old Alaska as he had. In 1974, Frank Glaser died at the age of 85. No fancy funeral, no great public mourning, just a small notice in the Fairbanks paper. Francis Glaser, longtime resident and retired wildlife agent, passed away Tuesday at Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. A simple end for a man who had lived an extraordinary life. But in Alaska, Frank Glaser never really left. His name still rides the wind, hooked onto wolf howls. His stories thunder across bar tops, slip through trapline cabins and rumble out of old-timers' mouths when they talk about how things used to be. The man is gone, but the myth is still kicking. You close your eyes, feeling the softness of your pillow, the warmth of your blanket, so different from the harsh ground Frank slept on for most of his life, so far removed from the killing cold of an Alaskan winter night. And somewhere, in that space between waking and sleeping, you can almost hear it, the howl of wolves across a snow-covered valley, the sound Frank Glaser followed for 40 years, through blizzards and darkness, through solitude and silence, through a life most of us can barely imagine. A life wild and harsh and free. The first wolf biologists to use radio collars in Alaska made an interesting discovery in the 1980s. After months of high-tech tracking, sophisticated data analysis and computer modelling, they concluded something that would have made Frank Glaser laugh. Wolves behaved exactly as he'd been saying they did for decades. "We spent $500,000 to confirm what Frank told us for free," one researcher admitted later. Frank's observations, made with nothing more than binoculars, patience, and a mind that missed nothing, had been dead accurate. Pack territories averaged the size he'd estimated. Hunting patterns followed his descriptions. Den site selections matched his predictions. The man had been a walking, talking wolf encyclopedia long before modern science caught up. But Frank's legacy runs deeper than just being right about wolves. His impact spreads through Alaska's wildlife management like roots through permafrost. The hunters, trappers, and biologists he mentored carried his knowledge forward, shaping how the last frontier manages its predators. "Frank never wrote a book," said Jim Reardon, an outdoor writer who knew him well. "Never published scientific papers, but he taught a generation of wildlife folks more about wolves than any university ever could. His methods, the way he read tracks, the way he set traps, the way he understood wolf behavior, became standard practice, often without people even knowing where the techniques originated." Jack Wilson was 16 when he first met Frank. It was 1962, and Jack's father had hired the aging wolfman to deal with predators killing their sled dogs. "I remember this skinny old guy climbing out of the bush plane," Jack told me years later. "Didn't say much, just asked to see whether dogs had been killed." Frank spent 10 minutes examining the scene, then pointed to tracks most people would never have noticed. "3 wolves," he said. "Young pack, inexperienced. They'll be back tomorrow night." Jack's father asked how he could be so sure. "Killed messy," Frank said. "Didn't eat much, still hungry?" "Still learning." That night, Frank set 3 traps in places that seemed random to Jack. The next morning, they caught 2 wolves. The third never returned to the area. Dad offered him a bonus, Jack remembered. Frank just shook his head and said, "Regular pay is fine." Wasn't about money for him. Before Frank left, Jack, wolf crazy like most teenage boys, peppered him with questions. To everyone's surprise, Frank answered them. Spent an hour showing the kid how to read wolf sign, how to understand what the tracks were saying. "Changed my life," Jack said. "Ended up studying wildlife management in college because of that 1 hour with Frank Glaser." There are dozens of stories like this. People whose brief encounters with Frank shaped their understanding of wilderness, of wolves, of Alaska itself. A woman named Sarah Komar met Frank in 1968 when she was a graduate student researching wolf vocalizations. She'd spent months recording howls, trying to decode their meaning. Frank listened to some of her recordings, then took out a pencil and paper, drew a diagram of what each howl meant. Short barks, warning, long rising howls, location calls, quick yips, excitement over a kill. "How do you know this?" she asked. "Listened," he said simply, "for 40 years. Her thesis committee initially dismissed Frank's interpretations. He had no degree, no scientific credentials, but when she played recordings to wolves in captivity, their reactions matched Frank's predictions exactly. The professors called it a lucky guess, Sarah told me. It wasn't. Frank understood wolf language better than any human alive. These stories matter because they show something important about Frank Glaser. He wasn't just a killer of wolves, he was their student, their translator, maybe even their advocate in his own complex way. Frank had this saying, remembered Tom Clausen, who worked with him in the 1950s. Know what you're killing meant don't just shoot something because it's there. Understand it, respect it, make the death mean something. In the decades since Frank's passing, Alaska has changed dramatically. Wilderness has receded, tourism has exploded, wildlife management has become more political, more complicated. But out there, in the vast stretches that remain wild, wolves still howl, still hunt, still live lives not so different from the ones Frank observed decades ago. In some ways, Frank would hardly recognize today's Alaska. Fairbanks, once a frontier outpost, is now a modern city. The Savage River, where his cabin stood for 13 years, runs through Denali National Park, visited by thousands of tourists each summer. Those visitors, snapping photos from tour buses, might catch a glimpse of a wolf loping across a distant ridge. A brief encounter with wildness, safely contained. Frank lived differently. He didn't visit the wild. He inhabited it, merged with it, became part of its brutal, beautiful rhythm. Frank wasn't watching wolves from the outside, said Bill Nannock, a native Alaskan who hunted with Frank in the 1960s. He was inside their world, thinking like them, moving like them. Sometimes I wondered if he thought he was one of them. There's a story from the early 1950s that captures this perfectly. Frank was tracking a pack near the Yukon border in midwinter, temperature around 30 below zero. He'd been following them for days, observing their hunting patterns. One night he made camp on a ridge overlooking their kill site. A moose they'd brought down in a frozen marsh. Instead of setting up his tent, Frank dug a snow cave, just like wolves do during storms. Around midnight, the alpha male approached Frank's position, stood 20 yards away, looking directly at him. Frank remained absolutely still. Man and wolf stared at each other for nearly 10 minutes. Then the wolf did something extraordinary. It turned its back on Frank and sat down. A gesture that, among wolves, signals trust. Never told anyone about that until years later, said Pete Raftery, who heard the story directly from Frank. Said it was too personal, like a religious experience. When Frank finally shared the story, he added, "That wolf knew exactly what I was, knew I was a killer of his kind. But he also knew I understood him, respected him. That was enough." These moments of connection, a human and a wild creature seeing each other truly, were rare and precious to Frank. He didn't talk about them much, didn't need to romanticize them, but they shaped him, changed him. The young man who arrived in Alaska in 1915 was not the same person who died there in 1974. The wilderness transformed him, and wolves were his greatest teachers. Late in his life, Frank told a young biologist, "You want to understand wolves? Stop trying to make them something they're not. They're not monsters. They're not saints. They're just trying to stay alive in a hard world. Same as you, same as me." This clear-eyed perspective, seeing wolves as they truly are, not as human fears or fantasies project them to be, was perhaps Frank's greatest contribution to wildlife science. In the decades after Frank's death, wolf management in Alaska became increasingly controversial. Some wanted wolves eliminated to boost game populations. Others wanted them protected completely. The middle ground, where Frank had stood, seemed to vanish into partisan extremes. Frank would have hated the politics of it all, said George Peterson, who worked in wildlife management in the 1980s. He believed in balance, in managing, not eliminating, in respecting the role of predators, even as you controlled their numbers. This balance, this recognition that wolves belong in Alaska, but so do humans with their own needs and interests, seems increasingly rare in modern debates. The nuance that Frank understood through direct experience gets lost in ideology. Frank wasn't pro-wolf or anti-wolf, said Ray Morris, who trapped with him in the 1960s. He was pro-balance, pro-ecosystem. He understood that everything out there is connected. This ecological understanding came not from textbooks, but from decades of observation. From watching what happened when wolves were removed from an area. From seeing how prey populations exploded, then crashed from disease or starvation. From recognizing the complex relationships that keep wilderness healthy. He told me once that killing every wolf would be like removing your liver, Ray remembered. You might feel fine at first, but pretty soon the whole system breaks down. Beyond his impact on wolf science, beyond his legendary status in Alaska lore, there was something else about Frank Glaser that deserves remembering. Something more personal, more human. He found his purpose. In a world where many people drift through life never quite sure what they're meant to do, Frank knew. From that first brutal trek to Fairbanks in 1915 to his final days, he lived exactly the life he chose. Most folks spend their whole lives fighting against what they are, said Bill Pearson, who knew Frank in his later years. Frank just was. No pretense, no trying to be something else. Just a man who found his place and lived in it completely. That authenticity drew people to him, made them listen when he spoke, made them remember him decades after he was gone. In 1998, almost 25 years after Frank's death, biologists studying wolves in Denali National Park made a discovery. They found the remains of a cabin near the Savage River. Frank's cabin. After all those years, traces still remained. Rusted trap parts, a broken snowshoe, the foundation stones of his fireplace. They also found something unexpected, a metal box buried near the cabin site. Inside was a small notebook, its pages yellowed but still legible. Frank's handwriting, precise and small. It wasn't a diary or journal, not in the traditional sense. It was a record of wolves. Individual wolves Frank had known over his years at Savage River. Names he'd given them, descriptions, personalities. Black female, scar on muzzle, smart, cautious at kills, good mother, died winter, 29. Grey male, distinctive howl, bold hunter, led pack for 6 years, killed by younger male spring 34. White female, small for her age, quick learner, left to form new pack fall 31, successful. On and on, dozens of wolves, each remembered, each noted with a precise, almost tender attention to detail. The biologists who found the notebook were stunned. This wasn't the record of a simple wolf killer. This was the work of someone who knew these animals intimately, who saw them as individuals, who recognized their unique traits and histories. It was like finding Jane Goodall's notes on chimps, one researcher said, except Frank was doing this kind of detailed observation decades earlier, with no training, no support, no recognition. The notebook is now preserved in the University of Alaska archives, a small private testament to a relationship between man and wolf that defies easy categorization. In your warm bed, far from the killing cold of an Alaskan winter, far from the howl of wolves across moonlit snow, it's hard to fully grasp what drove Frank Glaser, what kept him in that wilderness alone year after year. But maybe there's something in all of us that recognizes the appeal of such clarity, such purpose, such belonging. Frank once told a young trapper who asked why he lived as he did, "Out there, everything makes sense. You're hungry, you hunt, you're cold, you build fire, you're tired, you rest. Simple, true, no one telling you who to be or what matters." In that simplicity, that directness, Frank found freedom, not the shallow freedom of doing whatever you want, but the deeper freedom of living in accordance with your nature, of being fully yourself in a world that so often asks us to be something else. The wolves taught him that. They don't pretend. Don't compromise their nature. They simply are what they are. Predators, survivors, members of an ancient social order that functions perfectly without human intervention. Frank learned from them, became more wolf-like himself, direct, uncompromising, attuned to the rhythms of the wild, comfortable with solitude. "You know what I admired most about him," said Jean Adams, who interviewed Frank for an article in 1970. "He wasn't lonely. Most people can't stand being alone for a day. Frank went months without seeing another human and was completely at peace with it." That capacity for solitude, for self-reliance, seems increasingly rare in our connected modern world. We're always in touch, always reachable, always surrounded, if not physically, then digitally. Frank lived differently. His connections were to place, to wolves, to the vast Alaskan wilderness that shaped him over decades. "Last time I saw him," Ray Morris told me, "he was sitting on the porch of the Nordale Hotel, just watching people go by. I asked what he was doing. He said, observing the strangest animal of all. Then he laughed, only time I ever heard him really laugh. That distance, that ability to see humans as just another species, neither better nor worse than wolves, gave Frank a perspective few people ever achieve. He watched us with the same clear, unromantic eye he turned on wolves, saw our patterns, our social structures, our strengths and weaknesses, and perhaps in that seeing he found a kind of peace, an acceptance of the world as it is, not as we might wish it to be. As you drift closer to sleep, imagine Frank one last time. Not the legend, not the myth, just a man who found his place in the world and inhabited it fully, who listened to wolves howl across snow-covered valleys and heard something most of us will never hear. The authentic voice of the wild, speaking directly to something ancient and knowing in himself. In that exchange, wolf to man, wild to human, Frank Glaser found something worth dedicating his life to, something worth remembering, even decades after he's gone. If you fly over Alaska today, you'll see a landscape that would both surprise and sadden Frank Glaser. Roads cut into valleys he once crossed on foot, tourist lodges perch where he once camped alone, airstrips flattened tundra he navigated by the stars. But look more carefully past the human footprint into the vast stretches that remain wild, and you'll see something Frank would recognize. Wolves, still running free, still hunting, still howling across valleys as they have for thousands of years. Alaska's wilderness has shrunk, but it hasn't disappeared, and in the people who work there, who study it, who fight to protect it, Frank Glaser's influence lives on, sometimes in unexpected ways. Take Mike Robards. He's a wolf biologist who spent 20 years tracking packs across Denali National Park, the same area where Frank built his cabin on the Savage River almost a century ago. First time I read about Frank Glaser, I thought he was the enemy, Mike told me, sitting in his small office in Fairbanks. I mean, the guy killed hundreds, maybe thousands of wolves. As a conservationist, how could I admire that? But the more Mike learned about Frank, his methods, his observations, his deep understanding of wolf behavior, the more his perspective shifted. What struck me was his respect for them, Mike said. He wasn't killing out of hatred or fear. He was doing a job, maintaining a balance. And along the way, he learned things about wolves that we're still confirming with our fancy technology decades later. Mike gestured to a wall of computer equipment, tracking software, satellite data. We've got all this now, and sometimes I think Frank would laugh at us. He'd say, just go sit on that ridge for a week and watch. You'll learn more than your computers will ever tell you. That direct experiential knowledge, the kind that comes from patient observation rather than data analysis, is increasingly rare in wildlife science, but a few people still practice it, still value what Frank knew, that understanding comes from time spent watching, listening, being present in an animal's world. Lisa Kowalski is one of those people. She's not a scientist, not a wildlife manager. She's a wilderness guide who takes small groups into remote areas of Alaska to observe wolves in their natural habitat. I'm out there 3-4 months a year, she told me, just watching, just being with the wolves on their terms. I've read all about Frank Glaser, different time, different goals, but same approach. You want to understand wolves, you go where they are, you adapt to their world, not the other way around. Lisa has followed one particular pack, the East Fork pack in Denali, for over a decade, knows each wolf individually, can recognize them by sight, by howl, by track. People ask me how I can tell them apart, she said. I just can, same way you can tell your friends apart in a crowd. Once you really look, really see them as individuals, it's obvious. That echoes Frank's notebook with its detailed descriptions of individual wolves he'd known over years. That recognition that wolves aren't interchangeable units in a population but distinct beings with personalities, histories, roles within their packs. I never met Frank Glaser, Lisa said, but sometimes sitting on a ridge watching wolves hunt, I feel like he's sitting right beside me, noticing the same things, asking the same questions. This sense of connection across time, of shared experience despite vastly different contexts, comes up again and again when talking to people who work with wolves in Alaska. Tony Peterson flies bush planes into remote areas for wildlife surveys. He's tracked wolf packs from the air for 30 years, working for various agencies and research projects. In training, they showed us Frank's maps from the 1940s and 50s, Tony told me. Hand-drawn, incredibly detailed, and you know what? They're still accurate. Pack territories, denning areas, travel corridors, they haven't changed much in 70 years. Tony keeps a copy of one of Frank's maps in his plane, faded, creased from use, but still a valuable reference. He didn't have GPS or satellite imagery, Tony said, just his eyes and his brain and thousands of hours in the field. Made me realise there's no substitute for that kind of direct experience. Even those who might seem most opposed to Frank's work, modern wolf advocates and conservationists, often express a grudging respect for him. Sarah Johnston works for a non-profit dedicated to wolf protection in Alaska. When I mentioned Frank Glaser's name, she didn't react with the hostility I expected. Look, he was a product of his time, she said. The government hired him to kill wolves, and that's what he did. But he didn't hate them. He respected them, understood them, and his observations helped build the foundation of what we know about wolf ecology today. She leaned forward, elbows on her desk. The irony is, some of our strongest arguments for wolf protection come from Frank's own notes. He documented their complex social structures, their role in maintaining healthy ecosystems, their intelligence and adaptability. He saw them clearly, without romanticism, but also without demonization. That clear seeing is still valuable, regardless of what side of the conservation debate you're on. This is perhaps the most surprising aspect of Frank Glaser's legacy, that a man who killed wolves professionally for decades has become, in some ways, an ally to those who seek to protect them. His detailed observations, his insistence on understanding wolves as they truly are, rather than as human fears or fantasies paint them, provides common ground in debates that often seem hopelessly polarized. Frank would have hated how political wolf management has become, said James Wilson, who worked in wildlife management for 40 years. He believed in balance, in making decisions based on what's happening on the ground, not ideology, in respecting wolves even as you recognize that sometimes their numbers need to be controlled. That pragmatic, experience-based approach seems increasingly rare in environmental debates where extreme positions often drown out nuanced understandings. But in Alaska, where wolves and humans still share the landscape, Frank's balanced perspective remains influential among those who work directly with wildlife. Most of the old-timers who knew Frank are gone now, James told me, but their stories about him, their memories of what he taught them, that's still being passed down, still shaping how we think about wolves. One such story comes from Ben Taller, now in his 80s, who briefly worked with Frank in the 1950s. "We were flying over the Koyukuk River drainage, spotting for wolves," Ben recalled. "Found a pack feeding on a moose kill. Frank had me circle 3 times, just watching. Then he said something I never forgot. He said, 'Those aren't just wolves down there. That's a family. Mother, father, this year's pups, last year's young adults. They've got a history together, got relationships, got a future, if we let them.'" Ben shook his head, remembering. Then he raised his rifle and shot the alpha male. Clean kill. The pack scattered. Frank was quiet on the flight back. That night, he told me, "Never forget they're more than targets. Even when you have to kill them, remember what they are." This complex relationship, respect and understanding paired with the brutal practicality of predator control, defined Frank's approach to wolves. It's a complexity that resonates with many Alaskans today who still live with the reality of large predators as neighbors. In native Alaskan communities where traditional knowledge about wolves stretches back thousands of years, Frank Glaser is remembered as someone who bridged worlds, the scientific and the traditional, the practical and the spiritual. "My grandfather talked about the wolf man," said Robert Sam, an Athabascan elder, said he understood wolves in the old way, not like the scientists who come up from the lower 48 for a summer. Frank lived with them year-round, through the hard times, saw them as they really are. That old way of knowing, direct, experiential, rooted in the land, is increasingly valued by scientists who recognize its worth alongside more formal research methods. "We're finally catching up to what Frank knew instinctively," said Diane Harper, a wildlife biologist, "that wolves are keystone species, that they shape ecosystems in ways that ripple through everything from vegetation to bird populations to river dynamics. Frank saw those connections decades before the science formally recognized them." Frank's observations about wolf behavior have been validated by modern research again and again. His understanding of how wolf packs function as family units, how they communicate, how they select prey, how they teach their young, all confirmed by scientists using methods Frank could never have imagined. "He would have loved the camera traps," said Ryan Miller, who manages remote monitoring systems in Denali National Park. "Imagine what he could have learned with today's technology, given his patience and observational skills." The cameras Ryan places in remote locations capture wolves going about their lives undisturbed by human presence. These glimpses, wolves playing, sleeping, hunting, caring for pups, reveal behaviors Frank could only observe from a distance or infer from tracks and sign. "Sometimes I'll review footage and think, Frank already knew this," Ryan said. "He figured it out without cameras, without radio collars, without DNA analysis, just by watching, by paying attention, by being present in their world. This ability to truly see what's in front of you, to observe without preconceptions, to notice details others miss, was perhaps Frank's greatest gift, and it's one that transcends his specific role as a wolf hunter." I teach my wildlife biology students about Frank Glaser, said Professor Maria Chen at the University of Alaska, not because I want them to become predator control agents, but because I want them to develop his observational skills, his patience, his ability to read the landscape and understand what it's telling you. She requires her students to spend time simply watching wolves. No data collection, no specific research questions, just observation. They hate it at first, she laughed. They want to be doing something, taking measurements, running tests. I tell them, you are doing something, you're learning to see. This lesson, that knowledge begins with seeing clearly, is perhaps Frank Glaser's most enduring contribution to wildlife science and management in Alaska. In a world increasingly mediated by technology, where we often experience nature through screens rather than directly, Frank's approach feels almost radical. Get out there, sit still, watch, listen, learn. I've got students who can run sophisticated statistical analyses but can't read a wolf track in snow, Professor Chen said. Frank would have thought that was backwards. He believed you start with the direct experience, the data, the analysis that comes later after you've developed a feel for the animal and its world. This emphasis on direct experience extended beyond wolves to the entirety of Frank's relationship with wilderness. He knew Alaska in a way few people ever will, intimately, physically, through all seasons and weathers, through hunger and cold and solitude, through beauty and danger and the daily reality of survival. Alaska's changed since Frank's time, said Pete Townsend, a long-time resident of Fairbanks. More people, more development, more pressure on wild places. But if you get out there, really out there beyond the roads and towns, it's still the Alaska he knew, still vast, still capable of killing you if you don't respect it, still beautiful in that harsh, uncompromising way. Pete gestured toward the window where the Alaska Range rose blue and distant on the horizon. Frank's out there somewhere, he said quietly. Not his body, his spirit, his way of seeing, his understanding. As long as there are wolves in Alaska, Frank Glaser isn't really gone. As you lie in your bed, warm and safe, far from the howl of wolves and the bite of Arctic cold, Frank's story might seem like ancient history, a relic of a wilder time, a harder time, a time when humans and wolves engaged in a dance of predator and prey, of hunter and hunted across the vast Alaskan wilderness. But the wolves are still there, still running, still hunting, still raising their pups in dens not so different from the ones Frank found nearly a century ago. And somewhere in the collective memory of those wolves, in the instincts passed down through generations, perhaps there's an awareness, a recognition of the man who knew them better than any human of his time, who hunted them, yes, but also respected them, learned from them, saw them clearly, without fear or romanticism, as the complex, intelligent, social beings they truly are. In that recognition, wolf to man, wild to human, there's a kind of communion that transcends the simple categories of killer and victim, a shared participation in the ancient rhythms of predator and prey, of life and death, of survival in a harsh and beautiful land. Frank Glaser entered that communion fully, lived within it for decades, became, in some essential way, part of the wild he inhabited. And there, in that belonging, he found what so many of us seek, a life with meaning, a purpose aligned with his deepest nature, a place where he fit completely and without compromise. As you drift towards sleep, imagine wolves running across snow, their breath clouding in the bitter cold. Imagine Frank watching them from a ridge, rifle across his knees, eyes missing nothing. Imagine the moment of recognition between them, predator seeing predator, survivor seeing survivor. In that moment there is truth, there is respect, there is a kind of love that doesn't need a name, and in Alaska's remaining wilderness, that moment continues, between wolves and those who seek to understand them, between the wild and those who enter it with open eyes and humble hearts. Between the past, where Frank Glaser tracked wolves across untamed valleys, and the present, where his legacy shapes how we see and value these essential predators. The wolfman is gone, but the wolves remain, and in their howls across moonlit snow, perhaps his name still echoes. Today, in the visitor centre at Denali National Park, there's a small exhibit about Frank Glaser. It's easy to miss. Just a few photographs, some notes, a battered rifle similar to the one he carried. Most tourists walk right past it, drawn to the bigger displays about grizzlies and moose. But those who stop, who take a moment to read about the Wolfman of Alaska, often find themselves lingering. There's something in his story that catches hold, something that speaks to a part of us buried deep beneath our modern comforts and connections. People ask me why Frank Glaser matters today, said Karen Reyes, a park ranger who often tells his story to visitors. I tell them he represents something we've almost lost, a direct, unmediated relationship with wilderness. He didn't experience nature through a screen or a window. He was immersed in it, shaped by it, defined by it. In a world where most of us are increasingly disconnected from the natural systems that sustain us, Frank's story feels almost mythic, a man who lived by his wits and skills in one of the harshest environments on Earth, who knew wolves not as abstract symbols or endangered species, but as neighbours, competitors, teachers. The tourists who connect most with Frank's story aren't who you'd expect, Karen told me. It's not the hardcore outdoors people. It's often the office workers, the tech employees, the people most removed from the kind of life he lived. They're fascinated by him because he represents an authenticity, a directness of experience they sense is missing in their own lives. This hunger for authentic experience, for direct connection with the natural world, seems to grow stronger as our lives become more virtual, more mediated by technology and convenience. I had this guy from Silicon Valley spend 2 hours reading everything we had about Frank, Karen recalled. When he finally looked up, he had tears in his eyes. He said, "I make $1 million a year designing apps, and this trapper who probably died broke understood something about life that I'm just beginning to grasp." That something is difficult to define precisely. It has to do with presence, with paying attention, with understanding your place within natural systems rather than apart from them or above them. Frank wasn't a philosopher. He didn't write treatises about humanity's relationship with wilderness. But through his life, through his work with wolves, he embodied a way of being that feels increasingly rare and valuable. Frank lived in accordance with reality, is how Bill Thompson, a wilderness guide, put it. Not reality as we wish it was, or fear it might be, or try to make it through technology and control. Just reality as it actually is, beautiful, harsh, complex, unforgiving. This acceptance of reality on its own terms, not filtered through human expectations or desires, was at the core of Frank's relationship with wolves. He didn't hate them, didn't romanticize them. He saw them clearly as they truly are, and in that clear seeing found a kind of wisdom. The wolf biologist Rick McIntyre, who has spent decades observing wolves in Yellowstone, expressed this idea beautifully. The wolf is neither villain nor hero. The wolf is simply the wolf. When we can see that, really see it, we've taken the first step toward understanding not just wolves, but the entire natural world, including ourselves. Frank took that step, lived that understanding, every day through decades in the Alaskan wilderness. There's another dimension to Frank's legacy, one that might seem surprising given his profession as a wolf hunter. His story has become important to many conservationists, many advocates for wilderness protection. Frank Glaser's Alaska is vanishing, said Michael Green, who works for a conservation organization. The vast, unbroken wilderness he knew, the intact ecosystems, the abundance of wildlife, it's all under threat from development, from climate change, from the expanding human footprint. Efforts to protect what remains of that wilderness often invoke Frank's name, his experience, his deep knowledge of how those systems function. When we argue for protecting wolf habitat or maintaining ecosystem integrity, we're often drawing on insights that came from Frank and others like him, Michael explained. People who knew these places intimately, who understood the connections between predator and prey, between wolves and the land. It's another paradox in Frank's complex legacy, that a man who killed wolves for a living has become, in some ways, a symbol for those who seek to protect them and the wild places they inhabit. Frank wouldn't have called himself an environmentalist, Michael said. That term wasn't even in use during most of his life, but he understood something fundamental that drives much of conservation today, that everything is connected, that you can't remove one piece of the system without affecting everything else. This ecological understanding, gained not through scientific training but through direct observation and experience, was far ahead of its time. Frank witnessed firsthand what happened when wolf populations were reduced too drastically, saw the explosion of prey animals, the overgrazing, the eventual population crashes from starvation and disease. Balance, he wrote in one of his reports. Everything out here is about balance. That insight that natural systems exist in a complex balance that human intervention often disrupts rather than improves remains a cornerstone of modern ecology. Frank arrived at it by watching, by paying attention, by being present in the wild year after year. In some ways, Frank Glaser was a bridge between worlds, between the frontier Alaska of the early 20th century and the more regulated, more conscious Alaska of today, between the mindset that saw wolves simply as vermin to be eliminated and the understanding that they're essential components of healthy ecosystems, between the ethos of conquest and the ethos of conservation. He didn't fully belong to either world. He was too pragmatic, too unsentimental for the conservation mindset, too observant, too respectful of wolves for the old frontier mentality of extermination. He existed in the tension between those perspectives, found his own balance, his own way of relating to wilderness that was neither purely utilitarian nor purely preservationist. That middle ground is where most Alaskans actually live today, said Laura Simmons, who studies human-wildlife conflicts. They value wilderness, want to protect it, but they also live with it, use it, depend on it for their livelihoods. Frank's perspective, pragmatic but respectful, utilitarian but understanding, resonates with people trying to navigate that balance. This is perhaps why Frank's legacy endures so strongly in Alaska, why his name still comes up in discussions of wolf management and wilderness protection. His approach offers a path beyond the polarization that often characterizes these debates. A way of seeing wolves, seeing wilderness, that acknowledges complexity rather than reducing it to simple categories of good and bad, right and wrong. Frank used to say wolves aren't good or evil, they're just wolves, remembered Ray Morris, who knew him in his later years. Sounds simple, but that perspective changes everything, helps you see the whole picture, not just the parts that fit your preconceptions. In a time of increasing polarization, of hardened positions and ideological rigidity, Frank's clear-eyed, experience-based approach feels like a breath of fresh air, a reminder that reality is always more complex, more nuanced than our ideas about it. There's a story from the last years of Frank's life that captures this perspective perfectly. A wildlife manager was arguing with a rancher about wolf predation on livestock. Both men dug into their positions, the manager insisting wolves rarely kill healthy cattle, the rancher insisting wolves were destroying his livelihood. Frank, by then in his 80s, listened for a while, then spoke up. "Both of you are right," he said, "and both of you are wrong. Wolves do what wolves do. Sometimes that means taking down a healthy cow if the opportunity presents itself. Sometimes it means passing by 100 cows to hunt wild game instead. Depends on the wolf, depends on the situation. Nature doesn't follow our rules or fit our arguments." Both men fell silent. Frank had cut through their debate to something more fundamental, the reality of wolves as they actually are, not as either man wanted them to be. After that, the wildlife manager recalled, "We had a real conversation, started looking for solutions instead of trying to prove each other wrong." This ability to see clearly, to move past preconceptions and political positions to the reality underneath, it's a rare quality, one that seems increasingly valuable in our polarized times. Frank developed it through decades of watching wolves, of paying attention, of being humble enough to let go of his own assumptions when evidence contradicted them. "He told me once that wolves had been his best teachers," said Maria Chen, the professor who requires her students to observe wolves. "Not because wolves are especially wise, but because they forced him to see beyond what he thought he knew, to really look at what was in front of him." This quality, this willingness to see reality as it is rather than as we want it to be, extends beyond wolf management or wilderness conservation. It's a perspective that could help us navigate many of the complex challenges we face today, from climate change to political division to technological disruption. In his own quiet, pragmatic way, through his decades of work with wolves in the Alaskan wilderness, Frank Glaser embodied an approach to life that feels increasingly valuable, one grounded in reality, in direct experience, in clear seeing. Frank wasn't perfect, Laura Simmons emphasized. He was a product of his time, with all the limitations that implies, but he was something rare, a human being who found his place in the natural world and inhabited it fully, without pretense or romance or fear. That authenticity, that grounded presence in reality, is perhaps Frank's most important legacy, more than his contributions to wolf science, more than his legendary status in Alaska lore, more than his influence on wilderness management. His life stands as an example of what it means to be fully present in the world as it is. To watch a wolf hunt without judgment or projection, to feel Arctic cold without complaint, to face wilderness not as enemy or playground, but as home, demanding but also nurturing, harsh but also beautiful. In our climate-controlled rooms, our mediated experiences, our lives increasingly removed from natural rhythms and realities, Frank's story calls to something in us that remembers, that knows, somewhere deep in our DNA, what it means to live in direct relationship with the natural world, to be shaped by it, challenged by it, completed by it. The wolves Frank knew are long gone. Their descendants still run wild in parts of Alaska, still hunt and howl and raise their young in ancient patterns, still embody the wildness that drew Frank Glaser north in 1915, that kept him there for 60 years, that shaped him into the Wolfman of Alaska. Those wolves carry no memory of Frank, no awareness of the human who watched them so carefully, learned from them so deeply, sometimes killed them, but always respected them. But we remember, we carry his story, his perspective, his hard-earned wisdom about wolves and wilderness and what it means to find your place in the world. In Denali National Park today, visitors sometimes hear wolves howling in the distance. The sound cuts through everything, through technological distractions, through mental chatter, through the comfortable bubble of tourism, connects directly to something primal in the human brain. When people hear that howl, they stop talking, Karen Reyes said. They just listen, and for a moment they're experiencing Alaska the way Frank did, directly, without filters, just human and wolf and wilderness. These moments, these direct encounters with wildness, are increasingly rare in our managed, mediated world, but they remain essential. Remind us of realities larger than our human concerns. Connect us to ancient rhythms and relationships that shaped our species for millennia. Frank Glaser lived immersed in those realities, those rhythms, made his peace with them, found his place within them. Frank wasn't religious in any conventional sense, said Pete Townsend, who knew him in his later years, but he had something like faith, a deep trust in the patterns of the wild, in the balance that emerges when all parts of the system are allowed to function, wolves included. That trust, born not of ideology but of direct observation over decades, guided Frank's approach to wolves, to wilderness, to his own place within the natural world. As you lie in your warm bed, safe from the Arctic cold that shaped Frank Glaser, from the wolves he hunted and respected, from the harsh realities of survival in the Alaskan wilderness, his story offers something valuable, a glimpse of a life lived directly, authentically, in full acceptance of reality as it is. A life that found meaning not in comfort or convenience or control, but in understanding, in clear seeing, in belonging to a place so completely that you become part of its story as it becomes part of yours. Perhaps, as you drift towards sleep, you can imagine it, the vast silence of an Alaskan winter night, stars burning cold and bright above snow-covered mountains, the howl of wolves echoing across a frozen valley, and Frank Glaser standing motionless in that landscape, rifle across his knees, watching, learning, belonging. The Wolfman of Alaska is gone, but the wilderness he loved remains. The wolves he studied still run free in parts of that great land, and his story, his unique, complex relationship with wildness, still speaks to something in us that remembers, that knows there is wisdom in the wild. In paying attention, in seeing clearly, in finding our place in the world as it truly is. As your breathing slows, as your body settles deeper into comfort, you might find yourself listening, not for the sounds of your room, your house, your neighborhood, but for something more distant, more ancient, the quiet padding of wolf paws across snow, the soft communication between pack members, the howl that rises, haunting and beautiful under a moon so bright it casts shadows across the endless white. In that sound, in that awareness, you might find what Frank Glaser found, a connection to something larger than yourself, a reality that was here before us and will remain long after, a wilderness that shapes us even as we shape it. And in that connection, that awareness, perhaps you'll find rest, deep, genuine rest, the kind that comes not from escaping reality, but from accepting it, from finding your place within it. Like Frank Glaser did in his own way, in his own time, the Wolfman of Alaska, a hunter who respected his prey, a loner who understood community, a human being who found his home in the wild, and in doing so found himself.